Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this, the second seminar that we are presenting on our second semester Indexing Transformation series, which is themed University Transformation. Before I introduce our speaker, Steve Fuller, who's come all the way from Warwick in the UK, I'd like to just say something about what we're doing in this Mellon-funded seminar series. We have a series of interesting speakers lined up this semester on this issue of university transformation, change in not just our institution, but the system as a whole, all South African universities. Steve is going to bring a bit of international perspective here today as well, give us a wider context maybe. 2 weeks ago we had a very interesting session organised by Rob on the centenary, which of course is a big issue at Stellenbosch here this year. Next week we have Shorsi Kesi speaking to us, and week after that Jonathan Janssen, who most of you probably know of. We also have in the immediate future Leslie Bank and David Cooper speaking to us, and we also have a roundtable discussion on the language issue, the Taaldebat, at Stellenbosch and elsewhere coming up. Right, I want to introduce Steve Fuller now. And Steve is the Auguste Comte Chair of Social Epistemology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick, which is in the Midlands in the UK, which is actually where I did my PhD and where I met Steve as a PhD student doing coursework a couple of years ago. I won't date either of us.
No,
by saying when that was. But let me just say something about Steve in the context of sociology and social epistemology, which is a kind of research project that he has quite a few years of history with now, which is grounded in sociology very much. But I think what's unique about Steve is the extent to which he brings a certain history in the philosophy of science and the history of science. And I think this is really what struck me as a PhD candidate, was sitting in one of Steve's classes, is just the extreme breadth of his historical knowledge of the university and science over time. So I'm going to mention, he has more than 20 books. He's amazingly prolific. So I'm not going to mention them all. I'm going to just run through a list of some of these. Maybe I don't even do justice when I say his more well-known titles. There's some of the ones that I picked out. His first book, and indeed a journal which he established, was called Social Epistemology, right? Which is the kind of eponymous theme of his research over the years. He also produced books titled Philosophy, Rhetoric, and the End of Knowledge, The Coming of Science and Technology Studies, which has been a long-running theme of his, The Governance of Science, a book titled Kuhn versus Popper, The Struggle for the Soul of Science. A couple of years ago he did a book called the New Sociological Imagination, which a lot of you will recognize through reference to was a follow-up to the, of course, very famous work by C. Wright Mills, titled Sociological Imagination. And more recently, he's been doing a lot of work on this issue of humanity. And the key book there was Humanity 2.0, which is now a couple of years old. And 2 days ago, he presented at the CST on a topic drawing more or less on ideas that he's developed since the publication of this book. But today he's going to be drawing on a new book, which I believe is out, and which we're going to be discussing later this afternoon. If some of you want to stick around at 3 o'clock to be part of the book discussion, the roundtable, in room 401 back in the sociology department at 3 p.m. And the title of this book is PostTruth, Knowledge as a Power Game. And I think it's this year, right? It's this year's.
It is May,
right. Right, so the title of Steve's presentation today is Can Universities Survive the Post-Truth Era? Now this presentation draws on this book, and I think it's significant that we are sitting in the politics venue here, not just because I have a certain history here as well, but one of the key issues that Steve will be talking to is this kind of link, if you like, between politics and science. And like a good sociologist, he goes back to Weber, and he draws on this very famous set of essays that Weber wrote, called, respectively, Politics as Vocation and Science as Vocation. Now, of course, the kind of the basic idea there is not simply that politics and science are both vocations, but that they are in some respects similar vocations. And as you see, he's going to be his talk is very contemporary in the sense that he's speaking to issues that are very contemporary, notably the Brexit vote in the UK, which is very close to home for an American situated at Warwick and in the UK more generally for quite some time now, but also the whole Trump revolution in the USA. And I'd like to sort of contextualize it in our situation by picking up a kind of a politics theme and referring to our own, what we might call, mediated political economy narrative of what's been going on in our country over the course of the last 10 years. And here, of course, I refer to the long-running debate on state capture. Now, there is a certain narrative explanation, and it is a kind of social science kind of explanation of what's going on, that has presented what we've experienced in this country over the last who knows how many years as a form of neo-patrimonialism. This is a kind of a broad theory that has a certain currency in the wider literature on African studies. And neo-patrimonialism in turn is typically categorized as a form of rent-seeking. Now, here's the thing, Steve. I'm an academic, right? Like many people here, not all people, quite a few students here, but quite a few academics here as well, who, like me, get paid for a certain expertise in something, right? And given this, I'm not so sure that I like this idea of expertise as a kind of rent-seeking.
I'm sure you don't.
But
it is.
But I'm going to listen to you anyway. So with that, I welcome Steve further.
Okay. I'm going to shift this a little bit, just from the standpoint of this, in case I actually write anything that's significant. Let me just start by saying, let me thank Lloyd for setting this up the way he has. This is my email address, and if you want to contact me afterwards, this is where you go. Okay, what I'm going to do in the course of my talk is actually speak and actually sometimes type stuff, which I think should be clear to people who are here, but if not, let me see, what yeah, this is the problem of having this. Okay. Yeah, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak freely, and sometimes I will type stuff that in case people don't know about concepts and terms and so forth. But Lloyd has just raised something that I didn't quite think would actually become that significant to what we're going to talk about, but it is indeed significant. But let me begin in the beginning before we get to what he's trying to get at, okay? And so what we're talking about here is the post-truth condition, and I'm one of those people who actually believes that the post-truth condition is a serious thing, right? So in other words, that we shouldn't be thinking this is temporary or so forth. In fact, in this book that I've recently published, which Lloyd referred to, I believe the post-truth condition has always been with us. Because the post-truth condition, here's the thing, right? The thing you have to get clear in the first instance is it's not about people being against truth or anything of that kind. It's about challenging the foundations on which truth are determined. Right? So what we're talking about with the post-truth condition is a kind of meta level, right? Meta level challenge. Oh, sorry. Where are we? It's a meta level challenge. And so the idea here is not about truth per se, but rather the conditions under which truth is established. And this has been with us from the beginning. In other words, when I say the beginning, I mean the beginning of Western culture, because this is an issue. If you want to, want to understand one of the things that has sort of driven the West's self-understanding, it's been about this issue. It's been about how do you determine what truth is. That's a Western thing, right? Where in some sense you want to have a clear basis for this. Because most other non-Western societies have no problem with pluralism. But in the West, we have to somehow figure out a way in which we can determine what is true. That's a Western thing, determining what's true. I think that's the thing. And this is where you start to get into this issue, and in the history of Western philosophy, which is where normally this sort of thing starts, you get Socrates dealing with the Sophists. And the Sophists, again, I don't know how much to presume here, but if you, sorry. Yeah, the Sophists, right? So if you read Plato's dialogues, the Sophists, the people who Socrates is arguing against, right? So Plato is basically this kind of, he's the first philosopher in the Western tradition. He's a kind of dramatist, you might say. Socrates is his main protagonist, and the Sophists are the guys who Socrates is arguing against. And the Sophists are saying there are many different ways for setting the notion of truth. It depends who actually controls power. It depends who actually, has the say at the moment. And Socrates is saying, no, there's something else, something higher, something different, something beyond, right? That's where the issue begins in the Western tradition. It begins over this kind of issue. And so then the question becomes, what are we actually talking about here in this kind of dispute between Socrates and the Sophists? Are we talking about what's true and false, or are we talking instead about what is possibly true versus what cannot be made true, right? So in other words, are we talking about a game concerning a truth that everybody already agrees to, or a truth where in some sense someone has to establish it at the outset before we can tell what true and false are? And the post-truth condition is a situation which I think existed in ancient Athens, and I think exists in our own time and has existed throughout history, where basically what you're arguing about is not what's about true and false, but about the conditions under which things are true and false. So it's about the meta-level issues. It's about the meta-level issues. It's about who determines the terms under which something is regarded as true and false. I mean, you might look at this, to put it in a more prosaic kind of way, we're talking about what are the rules of the game? What are the rules of the game, right? So in other words, there's a situation in which you're thinking about the world as a kind of game, a field of play, and then the question becomes, what are the rules of that? And so the thing that you're mostly concerned about is not whether you win or lose, but what kind of game are you playing? What is the game? Right? And as you know from games that we have, the rules are different depending on what game you're playing, but it's very important to know if you're going to win, which game you're playing. And that's what the post-truth condition is about, basically. Right? It's about that kind of awareness. Okay? And this is the kind of thing that I think if you want to talk about what's been operative in terms of the history of Western philosophy, and not only in terms of intellectual thought, but also the way in which it's kind of enabled a certain amount of power to be attached to it, right? That it's had this kind of global influence and importance and so forth. I think this is kind of the general, if you want to, this is the general way you need to think about it. Namely, people are thinking about two things at once. Not only what's true or false, right, but also what game are they playing in terms of which something is regarded as true or false. And this shifts over time. Okay? So it seems to me this is kind of, at a very basic kind of way, this is what the West has been all about. Okay? And I think Christianity in particular, but Islam to a certain extent as well, has kind of capitalized on this in the sense that they have both been about, so when we talk about the post level, the meta level, we're talking about transcendence. We're talking about having a level that rises above what the ordinary people are doing, but involves some kind of higher level where in some sense you're in touch with what God is about, or the divine plan, or whatever you want to talk, however you want to describe it, right? That meta level, right, where the gods reside, right? That kind of idea, that thinking that we operate in a reality that's divided in this sense, that there's a game that we're already playing, but there's also the rules of the game, which in some sense, if we know enough, we might be able to change. Okay? This has been the Western trajectory, it seems to me. Okay? And Christianity and Islam in particular, because these are religions where we have a kind of notion of the gods and humans as connected, but somehow also somewhat detached, but there's some kind of governance over them. This I think, creates the kind of metaphysical imaginary that even in the secular era, we still abide by. Okay? So I think that, regardless of what culture you're coming from and so forth, this is kind of the narrative that one's feeding into here. Okay? And then the question becomes how you feed into this narrative. That's what it seems to me. Okay? But that's where we're coming from. Now, fast forward to where we are now and the sort of thing that Lloyd talked about. So we've got this situation in the year 2016, okay? And we've got Brexit. So Brexit is this moment where the UK decides that they are going to vote to leave the European Union after having been in the European Union for 40 years, and quite clearly benefiting from having been in the European Union for 40 years, there's no doubt about that, and in fact being maybe, certainly one of the dominant players in the European Union. So it's not like the UK has been somehow marginalized or something over the course of that 40 years it's been in the UK, in the European Union, right? The UK has in fact benefited very heavily from it, and all the major political parties historically have been in favor of being in the European Union. So in other words, there's no particular political force within the establishment, either Labour or Conservative or Liberal, whatever you're talking about, that's against being in the European Union. They've all been for it. But then, by a 52 to 48 vote, the British people vote against remaining in the European Union when put forward in the referendum in 2016. How about that? And nobody expected it, right? The point is nobody expected it, right? The experts said, no, it won't happen. Everyone knew it was a close run race, but there was this kind of idea that in the end, people will vote to stay in the European Union. Okay? How could they get it so wrong? Okay? Especially, and this is a point I think that's worth pointing out to people who aren't so familiar with UK politics, is that the Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, who's kind of a liberal Tory in a way, who didn't prepare, by the way, and this is where the problems really start from the UK side, didn't prepare for what it would be like if the UK voted against leaving the European Union. He didn't plan for this at all. He was a guy who actually used the referendum, which again, think about, I don't mean to backtrack too much, but the UK has a parliamentary system of democracy, okay? What a parliamentary system of democracy generally means is that the representatives are speaking for the people, and so that the people don't have to speak for themselves, right? In other words, parliamentary notion of democracy typically operates on the notion that the people who represent you know more about your own interests than you do. That is kind of the premise of parliamentary democracy, really. Okay? And so referendum are meant to be very rare things, very exotic things. It's only when the people who you've already voted to power can't decide the stuff for you. Then you open it up and you let other people decide. You let the people decide. And so referenda in the history of Britain, unlike the United States, is very rare. Very rare. However, David Cameron actually launched a referendum that was victorious, namely keeping Scotland in the UK. That was his idea too. Again, for those of you who think about UK politics, there was all this Scottish nationalism shit going on to break away from the UK. Cameron said, we'll call a referendum. We'll ask the Scottish people to decide the matter. 60-40, Scotland stayed in the UK. That was within a year of this referendum we're talking about now, Brexit. Okay? So the point here was this, Cameron thought, hey, I understand referenda. I can manage this. I can do it. Okay? But that wasn't what actually happened. So the point here was, was a case where you might say the parliamentary class, expert class of politicians, people who in the UK, as you probably know, are normally from very elite schools and universities and so forth. In fact, it's only with the current cabinet, the current Conservative cabinet is the first cabinet not to have a majority of cabinet ministers who didn't go to Eton as a public school. It's the current Conservative cabinet after Boris Johnson left. Okay? So we have a very elite kind of class of democracy going on in the UK, generally speaking. But it worked, right? It worked when, you launch a referendum strategically. You say, well, with Scotland, we know what these guys are about. They're going to stay in the UK, and that'll end all this Scottish nationalism bullshit. And they thought something similar could happen with regard to Brexit, right? End all of this, little Englandism kind of stuff that would move UK out of Europe. They thought, well, we'll see that off too. That was Cameron's thinking. I think that's very important to keep in mind. That was Cameron's thinking. It was part of a kind of liberal, elitist, expertisist kind of view. Technocratic, whatever you want to call it, kind of view. And if you look at guys in the UK like Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, they sort of saw, this is not really going to work. This is not actually going to work. We might be able to get something, But none of these people thought it would succeed. Whether for or against Brexit in the campaign itself, I don't think any of these people thought that Brexit would actually work, would actually succeed. Because what Boris and Michael Gove were probably on about was about political angling within this kind of elite class. So they sort of thought that the Remain people would win narrowly, which is what everyone predicted, and then those guys who were on the other side would have a kind of greater leveraging power with regard to whatever happened afterwards. What they didn't expect was that the populists would go against the whole thing, and that they would in fact blow it all open and make it look like British people don't want to remain in the European Union at all. And that's where we are now at the moment, okay? So that's what Brexit, and that's why it's very difficult to know where we go from here, because the current Prime Minister, who I think is doing a very good faith effort, is in fact proposed something which I think works for the people in the, tries to keep all the various sides in place, but doesn't work with the European Union, And so now I think we're going to be left in a situation where I believe we're going to have a second referendum where it's going to be either this really watered down, unappetizing deal that the prime minister's come up with, or it's going to be leaving in World Trade Organization rules, or it's going to be just staying in the European Union, which is what I prefer. So we're going to have I think there's going to be a three-way referendum down the line here. But the point here is, what I want to say about all this that's relevant to post-truth is the degree to which the elite classes, regardless of what side they stand on the issues for political gain, for political purpose, they underestimated that ordinary people might actually have a mind of their own and might judge things independently of what all these people are predicting about them. And I'm afraid to say this is what democracy is about. Okay, so the post-truth, this is where I would say the post-truth condition is here to stay. So in other words, all of this kind of intrigue and calculation and so forth surrounding Brexit, okay, and I would say, I'm a Remainer, and all the rest of it. But once you saw the vote happen, you began to realize, I would have thought anyone who's kind of, at least, intellectually detached from the situation would realize, is that people are deciding this for themselves, and they're not following what one expert class or another expert class thinks. They're deciding things for themselves. Okay? Now, you might say these people are being deceived. You might say that there are all kinds of machinations going on behind. We know about Cambridge Analytica and all this kind of stuff that's been talked about a lot in the press, where you have this kind of firm that not only looks at people's voting behavior and consumer behavior and all kinds of other things, but does it in such a way that they try to then determine who the swing votes are and then try to influence the swing votes. Well, it seems to me this is politics 2.0, right? In other words, this has always been happening in politics. It's just now that we have a high-tech way of doing it. And it may be that Cambridge Analytica violated particular rules of how politics gets conducted in the UK, but in principle, it seems to me this is normal operating business, okay? So in other words, it's convenient in a way if you don't like the result of the Brexit outcome to start thinking about what was the clever thing that these guys did that the other guys didn't do. But in fact, these clever things that these people did are in fact part of the way in which politics has always been operating in large, mass, complex democracies where you've done public opinion research, you've been doing all kinds of other things to figure out what people are going to think, how they're going to vote in advance, all the rest of it. All of this has been normal for almost a century now with regard to politics. And so you could single out Cambridge Analytica because of its technological prowess, but it seems to me it's business as usual. Okay? So I don't see this as sufficient. Let's put it this way. I don't see this as sufficient for invalidating the result. I think there's a kind of deeper issue going on here which has to do with the extent to which the political elites have underestimated the ability of the people to judge things for themselves. Okay? Because remember, and I think this is the point you have to actually pick, Boris Johnson, former foreign minister of this country, of the UK, right? I mean, I think the thing you got to learn about this guy is that this guy decided to be a Brexit person out of expedience, out of opportunism, because he wanted to make a kind of move within the Conservative Party, which was the dominant party and looked like it had a pretty good grip on politics in the UK, because the Labour Party was completely in shambles, and to be honest, I think it's still pretty much in shambles as the way things are going. But the point was, he thought he could make a killing by going on this direction and losing it, but then present himself as someone who represents an unrepresented minority. That's how I think Boris Johnson saw this. Okay? So in other words, he thought that he would lose the Brexit vote, but that he would be the one standing up for all these minority Brexiteers. However, when the Brexiteers turned out to be the majority, then issues become very complicated. Because then you have to run a government on Brexiteer premises. Not as Brexiteers who need to be accommodated, but rather Brexiteers who are dominant. And that's when things get very complicated. Okay, so I hope you understand kind of the logic of this situation. Because I think this is kind of where we are with the post-truth. And it's a matter about who controls the rules of the game. Okay? Because David Cameron, when he allowed a referendum for the Britain's remaining in the European Union, I think it's pretty clear, everybody believes, he thought this would be the easiest way to solve a problem in the Conservative Party, that once you put it out to a public vote, it will go away, just like the Scottish referendum thing did. But it didn't happen that way. And so why? Why? Now, you see, to me, when you look at something like this, right? And by the way, a similar story can be given about why Hillary Clinton lost with, vis-a-vis Donald Trump. It's because there's a sense in, and this is what I will put on the table. I think that, if you want to have a kind of take-home lesson or something to think about, is what democratization means. Okay? And I do think we have a fairly paternalistic notion of what democratization is, generally speaking, right? Namely, that we will extend the rights and privileges and so forth to people who are, like ourselves, to other people, and that over time, they will become kind of like us. Right? That's the idea. Right? One of the reasons why we have this great belief in education and extension of rights and so forth, where there's a lot of preparation, a lot of safety nets, and a lot of stuff like that, is because we sort of expect that those traditionally disenfranchised people at the end will become like us. But what if they don't become like us? What if, in fact, they, can we actually imagine that they could choose to be something different? And you might say, oh my God, what they're choosing is disastrous, it'll ruin them and so forth. But it's the choice they've made. What do we say? Do we say that we haven't gone far enough in educating them and preparing them for this? Or do we allow them to say, yes, this is how we should go? See, this is a situation I think we do face in democracies, right? How serious are we about it? And one of the reasons, here's the thing for you guys to realize, is that democracy has many different kinds of political forms. And the whole point about having something like a parliamentary democracy was because you kind of imagine the representatives were better than you were. They knew your interests better than you did. Edmund Burke, if you know about Edmund Burke in the UK, famous Whig politician at the end of the 18th century, right? He made this very clear in a lot of his statements, right? That the point of parliamentary democracy is to elect people who can represent you better than you can. Know your interests better than you can. That is still paternalism. That is not full democracy. You only have democracy when you have a referendum where people are directly voting on the issues. Right? And you assume, you can trust that they know enough and what the rest of it is. You have a campaign, people are exposed to various positions, and you trust that their judgment will be adequate to the vote that is being required of them. Okay? And in the United States has been very much more in favor of referenda, and that kind of thing than the UK ever has been. UK is a very strict parliamentary democracy. And so referenda is very rarely used. And that's why the very idea of having a referendum over something like Brexit, right, was seen by a lot of liberal people as being, that's against the rules. But then the question becomes, how does democracy work exactly? What is the long game of democracy? I do think this is kind of, in a way, what the post-truth condition eventually gets to, right? Namely, what's the long game of democracy? Namely, are we to imagine, so to my mind, as someone who spends a lot of his time thinking about the long issues, philosophy, history, whatever, parliamentary democracy has to be seen as a kind of way station, a kind of midpoint to something else. It can't be seen as the end. It can't be seen as kind of the ultimate expression of democracy. Okay? And I know that's a very difficult thing to conceptualize and so forth. But and of course the United States, if you think about the way in which the United States representative system with regard to Congress is organized vis-a-vis the UK, there's an interesting difference, right? Where the US has from the beginning very much concerned about population and then being concerned about difference with regard to the size of the collectives that are self-identified, which are the states of the country, right? So the U.S. in a way has a much more democratized version of the parliamentary system than the UK does. But at the end of the day, if we're talking about democratization, we have to think about all of these systems as just way stations, and at some point you have to actually trust the people to be able to decide things for themselves. And then the question becomes, what are the rules of the game for that? What are the rules of the game for that, right? And that's the post-truth condition, right? Because there's a sense in which the reason why something like Brexit and Trump makes us aware of a post-truth condition is because the mass of the population aren't operating under the same rules as the elites thought they were operating under. Right? That in some sense the rules had changed. And it wasn't, so in other words, it wasn't just, in the case of Brexit, it wasn't just this kind of elite game between Cameron, and Boris Johnson and all these other people in the Tory party who are scrambling for power, and that all the rest of the populace could just be used as pawns in these games. No, rather, these pawns actually had views of their own, and if they're given a chance to vote, will actually defy expectations. And expectations not only of the Tories, but expectations of the learned academic classes, most of whom are officially anti-Tory. Right? So it's not just we're talking about, the Tories were fooled, but rather it's everyone in any kind of established position. This is where the whole idea of anti-expert as being a kind of hallmark of the post-truth condition makes sense. Because when we talk about experts, for the most part, we're not talking about people who are part of the conservative establishment or anything like that. On the contrary, most of the experts that exist in places like the UK and the US, right, are in fact center-left, if not socialist people. And they were fooled too. Okay? So we're talking about, and this is where, when people think about populism, this is where populism, as a kind of unexplained variable enters into this. Right? Populism is this thing no one figured. populism becomes this kind of unconstructed kind of consciousness that somehow exists out there, and all of a sudden we discovered, right, because the experts on either side failed to get what they wanted. Okay? Now this is what the post-truth condition, I think, gets us to, and this is why you gotta, you look at a guy like Trump, right? Trump exemplifies the issue. He is not someone who can be understood within any of the normal categories, right? So even though he was victorious as a presidential candidate for the Republican Party, the fact that he was a Republican didn't matter, right? Half the Republicans wanted to disown him. Okay, so from the standpoint of the establishment, in terms of the establishment political structures, even in the United States, which is much more democratically organized than the UK is, you see this phenomena here. And so it does seem to me that there's something very deep going on. It's something that's always been with us in the history of the West, but it's something that's very deep, and regardless of whatever happens to Brexit, because I'm one of these people who thinks at the end of the day, from the British standpoint, Brexit may turn out to be just a nightmare where people have a second referendum and decide to remain in the European Union. That's still a possibility. It may well happen, and that may be how this whole story ends on the UK side. And of course, Trump may be impeached. Trump may not, get a second term in office. Though, frankly, if I were betting, I'd bet Trump will be getting a second term in office. But the point is that all of these things, you can put all this stuff aside, but nevertheless there is a kind of change going on, and it's a change that I would say is very much attached to the, increase in democratization. Okay? And if you want to say what it is that is in fact propelling this and going to keep this going, even if Brexit ends up failing, even if Trump ends up getting not reelected or impeached or whatever, it's going to be because of the access of two things. One is the access of information that people have on the internet to have alternative points of view, right? So the prima facie persuasiveness of expert authority is no longer there. That's one thing. But of course, the more education people have. So in other words, more people are being educated. They're learning about basic points about literacy and how to think for themselves and argue for themselves and all that very basic point. And normally the people who teach them think that if they learn these skills, they will move in a certain kind of political direction, but it doesn't follow that they will. They may move in some other political direction. But the point is the combination of the increase in general levels of education, plus the access to information on the internet, is increasing democratization in a way that I think people who have been pro-democratic have to embrace. In other words, we should actually have to embrace this, even though from the standpoint of our own particular ideologies and positions in society and so forth, we may not like. But that's kind of the price of democratization in a way, okay? And I'm not saying this is foolproof by any means, but I'm saying that this is kind of where history's going. And we have to, and those of us who are in the positions traditionally, people in this room, for example, if you're in this room, you're probably someone who's in a relatively privileged position, right? You have to be prepared, and you have to be open to these things, to these kinds of ruptures, to these kinds of things that are happening now. Because I don't think they're temporary. I think this is just unless you're going to shut down the internet and you're going to shut down the increase in literacy and education, you're going to have more of these kinds of ruptures in the future where the expert class will be surprised, will be dismayed, will be disappointed. And then the question becomes, what do you make of that? Okay? And I think that in a sense, those of us who think of ourselves as progressive, and I'm one of them, right? We have to learn from this. We have to somehow incorporate this into our progressive thinking. Okay, so I will stop here, if that's okay, and then open it up to questions? Okay.
We have quite a bit of time, so Steve is quite liberal with his time when it comes to questions. So can I take, let's take 2 or 3 at a time. And please introduce yourself. I know some of you are not with you. Please just tell us who you are and who's the welcome from. Let's just see stands.
Yes, people in the back here.
2, I think Don, 2 and Bernard. Okay? Don? You just speak up because
Thank you, Steve. Very interesting. I'd like to know your views on, you've explained the Brexit thing a lot from the perspective of how politicians thought things might pan out, their logical reasoning about projecting this and that. But how would you say that occurred for the average Brexiteer? What was the reasoning leading up to actually voting?
Well, look, there was all this stuff about immigration and race and all the rest of it, but I think that the politicians treated that as pawns, to be honest with you, okay? So I think, I mean, the issue of race and immigration, which has been very much part of the actual sociological discussion of the whole Brexit thing in the UK, I think to a large extent, well, if I may say so, I think that's, while that may have animated some of the people on the ground, I think the reason why it's being exemplified, it has a lot to do with the academics, because that's what they're interested in. I actually think the politicians thought the immigration and race thing were pawns. I think they actually took it very superficially. They may be wrong in having done that. Okay, they may be wrong in having done that. But I thought they treated it very, they saw it was just a pawn. And that's why if you look at most of the people who are supporting Brexit in the UK, most of these people are free market people who in a sense want to avoid the whole issue of immigration. In other words, they have no problem with free immigration. But what they did was they played on the sympathies of the sort of people who feel they've been disenfranchised by immigrant people and moving into the UK. And the academics have kind of jumped on this. The academics in the UK have jumped on this and have made the race and immigration issue the main thing about Brexit, whereas in fact I think this is the tail wagging the dog.
It's really interesting. For me, a thing that I would like you to expand on is this, you say this access to the internet, it is kind of a metaphor for just more information and easier access to it. There's a lot of people saying that it's not new, and we don't necessarily have more access because of the internet. If you go all the way back to the printing press, that also gave us more access for cheaper. And it did not necessarily improve democracy. And the same thing with the internet, we might have a few changes, but we don't necessarily have access to more because we're still limited by how much we can process.
Sure.
So I would just like to get your opinion on that.
Okay, first of all, look, are you going to, I'm going to challenge a bit the premise of your argument, namely, you think the literacy was a mistake, that the printing press was a mistake? No, you're not going to say that. Exactly. So let's be clear exactly what you're saying here, because some of your rhetoric sounds a bit like, oh, it was a mistake that we actually had literacy in the printing press because we can't actually process everything, that all the stuff that's been printed. No, don't say that. Okay, don't say that. Right? So the question is, what exactly are you saying here? Okay, yes, we have limited capacity and so forth, but we also have critical capacities, and look, we also have history as well, and we were talking, part of the premise of this talk is about what the universities can do, and talking about history is very useful here, okay? Because history can give us a sense of, yes, we've been, in a certain way, we've been through this before, and then we can learn from it, right? So that we're not just totally skeptical, as your question suggests, but rather we can learn from the ways in which the access that we get, how do we determine what is sufficient access and not sufficient access and all the rest of it. That is certainly I would have thought the history of literacy and the printing press would give us a lot of insight into that kind of idea if it's actually mainstreamed into the world in which we're talking about digital literacy. Okay? So I don't think this is hopeless at all, right? So there's a sense in which, if you want to talk about what is the role for the university in all this, it is in this regard, right, of actually, giving this kind of story so you don't end up saying, oh, it would, somehow thinking that the invention of the printing press was a great mistake or it was a disaster or something. Because I know you don't mean that when you ask the question, but it sounds a little bit like that. It sounds a little bit, and insofar as it sounds a little bit like that, encourages the climate of cynicism that I think exists in our time.
I'm Bernard, thanks for the very stimulating talk. I'm curious about the nature of information that the public are getting that is increasing democratization in your story. In other words, I accept the arguments that there's more information, there's a greater quantity of information.
Sure.
But what are the mediations of that information?
I know.
And how does that shape the nature of the democratic subject? In other words, yes, there's much more information out there. It's not so much faster. What are our capacities to judge that information? Interestingly, in the Trump election, there were a lot of statistics going on about, red state, blue state, and people were following those things. Now, that information is very useful, but what's the nature of processing that? There's been a lot of arguments about the kinds of publics that this information is producing. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, to unpack the nature of the information that people are receiving and its relationship to democratic subjects.
Okay. Well, so generally speaking, I think I think people should have as much information as available to them, and then, if you want to talk about the role of education, is to instruct people on how to process information. I mean, I think, if you want to make a very simplistic kind of correlation here, right, that education, higher education, is about instructing people on how to process information, but they shouldn't be afraid of dealing with information. Okay, so that's the point. And I think the people who voted in elections and so forth with Trump and with Brexit, I think they were processing information in the best way they thought they could. So there's a sense in which if you don't like how they process the information, if that's what you're, because look, there's a reason, you got to think about this. There are lots of reasons why Trump and Brexit happened. And it can't all be traceable, at least I don't think, it can all be traceable to the ability of people to process information. Okay? Right, especially in the Trump case, where we're talking about, I think, in the Trump case, much more clearly than the Brexit case. In the Trump case, we're talking about a guy who basically figured out the political strategy for winning a U.S. presidential election, which involves getting the majority of votes in the electoral college, right? Even if you lose by 3 million votes in the popular vote, right? And so you can attribute that to just Trump figuring out how to campaign strategically better. I think that's kind of most of what, to be honest with you, with Trump, I think that's what most of that is about. With the Brexit thing, I think it's a little more complicated. But at the end of the day, you have to say how much of that is attributed to people not knowing how to process information. Because that is a very popular trope that academics are putting forward now, right? People have been duped. People were deceived. People didn't know what was going on, right? We hear this all the time from academics. Is this really true? And if it, and the very fact that this is kind of the first line of defense on the people who lose shows a certain kind of distrust, not only for democracy, but also for their prior capacities to have educated people, right? Because all these people who would have made these votes that they didn't like and they're calling incompetent were people trained by them. Okay? Right? For the most part, that's what we're talking about here. And And so I'm wondering, to what extent can we actually, we in the expert class, can start to claim that the populace is incompetent when we're in fact the ones who train them to a large extent. And I think in the case of Brexit, this really matters a lot, because I wonder about the high-handedness with which academics have operated by saying people are deceived. And how do these people get deceived if you're such great educators?
So I know now we have two prominent cases here. Basically, you took us to two prominent cases of democracies, like high-profile democracies, and what happens. And it's hard to ignore these two cases because it's like two planes falling in the same year kind of thing. You know, so it is.
I know. So you're going to be a bit godlike about it, right? Let's hear it.
But if you now when these we are now in a particular year when the technologies that sort of led up to this post-truth era, as you call it, became sort of democratized, etc. But when these democracies initially became, or these technologies became available, the initial people who thought about it, the post-industrial kind of guys, like Daniel Bell.
Yeah, sure. In the 70s, yeah, sure. I was around then, yes.
Yeah, so these guys, they envisaged a kind of a different future.
Sure.
Kind of a technocratic.
Yes, they did. They imagined Hillary Clinton would be forever. Yes.
So, and in their kind of vision, where the state's ability to process large amounts of statistical information, and where we know much more real-time information about what's happening in the economy, etc. The kind of vision was that, and to some extent this happened in most advanced countries. The amount of decisions that are open to democracy were reduced, and
Sure.
a lot of things became, like even in our country, a big debate in our country would be inflation targeting. And the money supply is not open to parliament anymore because there's economists that know how this thing works, and therefore you guys can vote about other things, about changing street names, etc., but you cannot vote about whether we're going to print more bands. You know? So in this, how does your vision fit next to this?
Easy. I mean, easy. Silicon Valley is the answer. Namely, at the end of the Cold War, all of this, look, the technocratic vision was predicated on the state being the monopoly holder of the computer systems under which all this information was being generated and disseminated, okay? And so with the end of the Cold War, right, what happened was everything got decentralized and Silicon Valley came into existence in the way we understand it now. And everyone was allowed on a commercial basis, more or less, to find out about everything. I mean, and states are now playing catch up, trying to stop that in order to reinvent what you're talking about as the technocratic vision of the 70s. But this is the thing that Daniel Bell didn't see. He didn't see Silicon Valley. He didn't see that the Cold War would end and that states would end up as a result of the descaling from the military-industrial complex. They didn't see that part of that would be that the internet would end up becoming essentially commercialized, privatized, right, decentralized.
So if you now zoom out from your two cases now, so I mean that's a really good summary for the failure of the post-industrial vision. But if you zoom out from your two cases, and we don't, now I know the post-truth thing plays out in advanced democracies, but if we zoom out with it and we take a global view, because it does not look the same in places like China and
Yes.
etc.
Yes. No, China is very interesting in that regard because China understands the score, right? China understands the game here, right? And they're trying to, and that the state is trying to take control, right? It's trying to, in a way, kind of enforce its own version of a certain kind of technocracy, basically, right? It's not the technocracy necessarily that Daniel Bell was imagining, but its own kind of technocracy. No, that's right. No, and that's something that requires an enormous amount of state-centered power to be able to maintain. No. I see. I understand what you're saying there, right? Right. But the point is, let's assume that's not going to be the paradigm for the future. Because I think the China case is going to be very interesting to look at. But to be honest with you, they're going to have to put in a lot of effort to maintain that. They're going to have to put in a lot of effort to maintain that. And I think and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, right? The social credit scheme has gone into place, and that's very interesting. I have students working on that, in fact, because I think that's a kind of interesting indicator. But that would be the main, if you want to look at a countervailing trend, that would be what I would be looking at.
So you think China's efforts might be eroded by just the
I'm hoping it would be.
Because another alternative vision is that with the NSA, etc., America is going the way of China.
Well, that's what I worry about. Germany already has indicated that they're thinking about going the China way. I mean, no, I worry about that. That's why I think, for those of you who would like to think of yourselves as subversive people and want to undermine things, undermine China, right? Don't worry about the United States. Undermine China.
I'm completely in the wrong faculty. I'm from computer science, but
There's never a wrong faculty when we're talking about this shit.
so I apologize if my question is a bit vague or naive. Just touching on the last thing you mentioned in the 4 questions, are you proposing a dichotomy between authoritarianism, whether it be fascist or, for example, Leninist Vanguard Party, versus a direct democracy, and that we are heading towards one of the 2 extremes? And if so, how should we reconcile that with the values prescribed by our own individual ideologies?
Well, here's the thing. I actually have a lot of sympathy for individualist ideologies, okay? And over the time, as I've grown older and so forth, I've actually become more individualistic in a sense. I've moved more from socialism to liberalism as kind of my ideological pole. I have to say that. That's true. I've moved in that direction. I hate conservatism, though. But the point is, and in fact, I'm not even sure conservatism has a place in today's political spectrum. But in terms of socialism versus liberalism, I've moved more toward liberalism. And I think that this is a very interesting question that you're raising, because it seems to me that you're not necessarily going to get liberalism in the proper sense if you just have a fully decentralized system, especially if certain kinds of networks start to dominate over others, and there's no way of checking that, right? So in other words, if you imagine a system where you say, okay, we're going to just allow people to connect up in whatever they want, right? Whatever kind of biases or valences they already bring to the situation is going to determine what the outcome is going to be. And so you're going to end up having things biased in certain ways rather than other ways, which is, I think, very much against the spirit of liberalism. So you can have an authoritarianism spontaneously generated, right? I'm worried about that issue. That's the main issue that I worry about, to be perfectly honest. I actually think the whole idea of having a state being authoritarian, I know it might not be so clear to people now, but I think in the long term, that's not really going to be the issue. That issue is not going to happen. I think the main issue is going to be the idea of spontaneously generated orders ending up operating as de facto barriers and limits to what others can do in the future. That's the thing I worry about more.
Simon.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to ask 2 questions. My first question is very brief. When I think of the notion of post-truth, I think of postmodernism. I mean,
Sure.
I seem to equate the 2, and to give you my preferences, there is a lot of postmodernism around this and other universities, and it's important to study there, but I don't want to join the group. So my first question is about how you see the overlap or the equivalence between post-truth and postmodernism. My second, as I mentioned to you when I met you, is that I'd
He then says, if one wants to look at progress over the last 2 to 2.5 centuries, quote, the only way to know which way the world is going is to quantify. He then says, most indicators rely partially on technological development. So it's going back to Christian's point. He says there is a two-way street between science and technology, which I agree with, and I think both of us. In other words, he's in a sense a pragmatist. He's saying science's ideas that are the most relevant are those that actually can make a difference in the world in which we live. And then he writes, and this is, I think, the most controversial part of his book. He then writes, the world has made spectacular progress over the last 2.5 centuries in every single measure of well-being. Almost no one knows about it. Now, I suppose my question there, if I may ask, is if one looks at that form of technological measurement, it's not clear to me how one takes this in a postmodern or in a post-truth context.
Okay, look, the first point is, I think you're right to say that there is continuity between postmodernism and post-truth, and because if you're obviously old enough to remember, but some people in the room might not be, about what postmodernism was about. Postmodernism was very much about taking a meta-level view with regard to the conditions in which truth and falsehood were determined, right? I mean, it was about against meta-narratives, for example, and things like that from Lyotard and things like that. So there is a continuity between postmodernism and post-truth. There's no doubt about it. As with regard to what Pinker is saying, actually I agree with a lot of it, except for with regard to the lessons one draws from it, you might say. One of the things that I would say, it is true that I think is certainly in the global north that there is a generally agreed view about how you measure progress, and therefore you can talk about certain societies as having progressed more than others. So there is truth to this, right? And insofar as you buy those kinds of metrics, what Pinker is saying is more or less right. But I do think what the post-truth condition brings attention to is the fact that we actually do need some kind of formal ratification of these terms of engagement, right? In other words, we actually need the whole world to buy into the idea that these should be the terms in which we then show that something has moved, this far up the scale more than something else has moved up far the scale, right? And I think that's kind of what Pinker doesn't get, right? Namely, that Pinker's sort of assuming at the outset that everybody's on the same page with regard to the standards of evaluation, with regard to what makes a society progressive or not. I think he sort of assumes that. He just assumes we believe that, right? And then in terms of that, we can then talk about how long people are living, how much income they have, how much violence they have, all these various things that he looks at. But the point is that it's not obvious that this common standard has actually been agreed upon by the whole world. It's rather something that's been agreed upon by, quote, the relevant experts, right? And then that's the thing about Pinker, right? At the end of the day, it's all about the relevant experts, what the standards they set, and then if you accept those standards, then you can start charting who's ahead and who's behind. But if you don't accept those standards, then game over. There's nothing to talk about. We're still at square one. And I think that's kind of what the post-truth condition is drawing attention to is, how do you establish the kind of standards that Pinker is presupposing in order to make the claims for progress that he has made? That's what the post-truth condition is talking about. And I think that's a fair question to ask. Namely, does Pinker presuppose things that most people cannot in fact agree on as being a common standard against which then we judge whether something has gone better or worse? That's where I think the post-truth condition brings us to. But it's not that Pinker is wrong in some kind of unequivocal sense. Not at all. It's just that he presupposes too much.
I have a question on the sorry,
Matthew. Quite early in the talk, you mentioned that the parliamentary form of democracy should not be the end game of democracy. Have you conceptualized any other models of democracy?
Well, this is the thing. You see, this is.
Just tearing down parliaments, you know?
No, see, this is the thing. I don't have a solution in my pocket here. But I do think for those of you who think about the future of democracy, right? If you want to think about the future of democracy, institutionally speaking, I think one of the things you have to realize is that in a world where people have more and more access to information and feel more and more empowered as individuals, that parliamentary democracy is not going to be the answer. It's just not. Parliamentary democracy is about a world where a group of people in a constituency, typically geographically bounded, agree that some guy knows more than they do about their interests. That's basically what parliamentary democracy is about, okay? And the representative democracy that you see in the United States, you know, the advantages has this populational, basically. It took a long time for the UK to actually get populational-based representation, right? The U.S. figured that out earlier on. But the point is that's the issue, right? And insofar as you believe that each individual is, has the intelligence and the empowerment to be able to make decisions that have impact on the collective well-being, you have to be able to move beyond parliamentary democracy at some point. At some point. You have to aim to do that. I'm not saying we should do it now or tomorrow or whatever, but I think the fact that we've got this discrepancy between the referendum on Brexit and, because look, 4 out of the 5 members of parliament at the time the Brexit vote was taken, did not believe the UK should leave the European Union. Okay? 80% were against leaving the European Union. 52% of the people said they should. That should tell you there's an issue here.
I'll take more questions, but I want to ask questions. Steve, you haven't fully addressed my concerns as
well, you haven't said any concerns yet.
As a rent seeker. No, as a kind of rent seeker. You call me a rent seeker.
Yes, you are a rent seeker. You are. You all you experts. You're all rent seekers.
I haven't finished your books. I might be caricaturing your argument, but I'm not even, lots of your other stuff, you know. And what you haven't fully addressed yet in the speech, which is in your title, is the kind of the strategies of the university for dealing with this world. Now, in your own work, you know, one of the things I've taken from your work is this, you know, so-called Humboldtian synthesis in the 19th
Yes, that's right.
in the 19th century, in which the kind of university, in a sense, faced its first kind of transformation moment, when research kind of came on board with science, and it transformed the university into this kind of dual system of research and teaching.
No, well. Actually, it had already existed as a dual system. It's just the university began to incorporate it.
Yeah, sure. But I'm saying I'm interested in the form of the university. And one of the things you're saying in your book now, this one thing I did pick up, is that you're an advocate of teaching
Yes.
as a kind of context of democratization.
That's right. Exactly.
But I don't understand how that works. Maybe it's my selfish rent-seeking kind of.
It might well be. No. I'm glad you're open to that.
There's still a case for kind of a rent-seeking, a kind of. What's the logical extension of this type of doing away with academics of rent-seeking? We have serious debates about decolonization knowledge in this country. Does this mean that I need to take Twitter and get a poll on at the beginning of my class as to what we're going to read? Isn't this the logical extension of democratization knowledge?
No, look. What I'm talking about here, come on, don't. I know that decolonization is an issue in this country, and you can bring it up if you want, but this is different from what I'm talking about. This is what I'm saying. It's a different issue. It's a different issue. It's closer to the issue of popularization. Look, because the problem is that academics, in terms of the research culture, right, the way in which we do, I mean, to explain what Lloyd is alluding to here, is that part of what we call the Humboldtian settlement in the European university context, the idea that the academic should be both a teacher and a researcher at the same time, right? Obviously they're not doing both of these things simultaneously, right? But there's a question about how the two things relate to each other. And so you do research, and everybody knows that research, even if you've got 1 million people involved with you, whatever, with the natural sciences and all this, is in a certain sense a kind of privatized, very specific kind of thing. And especially if you come up with something that's very original and so forth, it will be something that no one will have come up with before, right? We grant that as what research is supposed to be about. The question is then, how does it become public? Right? It certainly doesn't become public simply by you publishing in an academic journal article, however kudos you get from your university and so forth. That's jack shit, right? I mean, that's just talking to the converted. That's just talking to other elite researchers, right? The way in which your research, if it is truly original and innovative, actually gets to the public is going to be through some kind of popularization that you manage to achieve in the classroom. Okay? And this is where teaching matters. And this is where you go against the... See, rent-seeking, for those of you who don't know, it's a term David Ricardo, early 19th century, classical political economy, right? In the early days of capitalism, who are the people who the capitalists hate? The landowners. The people who own land and do nothing with it except to perpetuate it. And you see, this is kind of how I imagine academics when they're purely in a research culture. They're rent seekers, right? Because the thing is that the only people who can actually understand what these amazing original things they're doing are people trained like them who've gone through the system. In other words, people who've paid the rent. They're the only ones who can get there. And the point of teaching is to kill the rents, is to make it more available. And that means that the person teaching has got to present the stuff in a way that is approachable and available to the audience, the people who need to have the knowledge, not because they're thinking about reproducing future generations of people producing that knowledge, but because they think that knowledge is relevant to them in whatever lives they happen to be pursuing. That's how you break down the rents, right? And so teaching is incredibly important as a way of democratization, because what it does is it removes all the jargon, all the bullshit, all the stuff that academics have to say in terms of the way they present stuff just to impress themselves with other academics, and get them down to the level of people who are not going to be academics, but who nevertheless can use this knowledge productively. And that's the anti-rent-seeking thing. And if the post-truth condition does nothing else, it should facilitate this breaking down of rent-seeking in academia.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I just have a question about the issue about expectation. So it seems this is sort of a defining issue in the post-truth condition. And I think you raised it in terms of the political elite were not expecting the result of it. But there is also another dimension, it seems, and I have the feeling that many people, for instance, that vote populist party in Europe, thinking of the case of Italy, did so in such a way just to sort of, we want to deliver a message to the mainstream, and we are happy in a way that until that party gets a vote, as long as it doesn't go to government and it doesn't take power to deliver this message. So it seems there is this question of expectation, not in terms of what things should be, how things should be, and what democracy should be about. And it's also what it should not be about, how things should not be about.
Sure.
So
yeah.
I don't know if you can.
Well, no, look, what I'm going to take at face value your description of what you're talking about. What I'm talking about here in my talk is about how we as academics should approach the general situation. That's what I'm talking about. I have no doubt that what you're talking about may be valid for the case of Italy and why people vote in populist parties. But the point is, as academics, how should we think about this situation? I think as academics, we're something more than just a kind of mirror or reflection of whatever the people we study happen to think.
Yeah, but so then the point is, how do we take into account expectation in our analysis towards how people will approach to the next election in the UK?
Well, it depends when the election. I'm not sure in the spirit in which you're offering this question. I mean, are you talking about as a politician, as an academic, whatever?
As an academic, given that we are really wrong with our analysis, of how things turn out, then it seems one central issue is expectation. Then how do we start rethinking our analytical tools to understand how people think?
Well, I think the first thing, just a general point, is that people aren't stupid, okay? I think that would be a great thing for academics to learn, is that people aren't stupid. And that people are reading the newspapers, they're following the media, they're understanding stuff, and they're processing them in very different ways. I mean, I think that's the first thing. One of the things that I would say, if you're someone who's actually in the business of trying to gain public opinion of people, and this is something that became very clear both with Brexit and the Trump campaign, is the last thing you want if you're a public opinion researcher, doing surveys, asking people, talking to them directly and so forth, is you don't want to come across as someone who is already elite, okay? Because I think one of the problems, and this was one thing that came out with the 2016 campaign, is the sort of people who are actually talking to voters, okay, were people who were regarded, who presented themselves because they were these clean-cut college students type people, right? It's always already having been left and likely to be Hillary supporters, and so they're asking these people from the Rust Belt of the United States about what they think about who should be president, and the people responding would just basically fake their responses, right? So there's a lot of evidence of faked responses, right? Because the kind of people who are approaching, right, are seen as antagonistic in some kind of way. All right, so at a very practical level, if you're actually trying to figure out what people are going to think, the last thing you want to do is to come across as someone who's their natural opponent. Okay, which I think is what's happened a lot in a lot of public opinion research and so forth. Okay, but otherwise, I mean, it's a tricky kind of issue. But I do think, here's where I think in the long term what we're going to have to settle with. And some of you may know about Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica, right? So this is this firm. And the reason why I bring this up, and it occurs in my post-truth book as well, is because this firm, which is a kind of a computer, a firm that basically searches data from voters, not only in terms of official things, but also from commercial data that's gained from mouse clicks and stuff on the internet and the rest of it, and tries to then get kind of a profile to enable them to predict voter outcomes. And what they do is they typically focus on swing voters, that is to say voters where it's very unclear about what they're going to vote based on their previous preferences, and then they suggest these are the people you need to target to win the campaign. And that was what was behind in the UK the bus, the famous bus that said 350 million pounds a week would be available for the National Health Service once the UK left the EU, which is 350 million pounds a week is the exact figure that the UK would receive if it leaves the European Union. So the idea is that was the basis on which it was made. But the point is that I think that's, even though that firm is being investigated for legal issues, I think that's the future, basically, right? That, in other words, there will be this attempt, and there was, insofar as we are more and more online on the internet, providing our data about what we're doing so freely, I do think that more and more elections will be, in fact, contested in this kind of way. And regardless of whether Cambridge Analytica violated the electoral codes of the UK at the given moment, the point is I think this is kind of where we're going on this kind of matter. And so I do think that this is where social scientists need to be orienting themselves and politicians orienting themselves. But again, I think this is part of what democratization gives us, namely that if you take people's thinking and preferences and all the rest of it seriously, then you're going to be eventually zeroing down on this kind of stuff. That's eventually what you're going to be talking about.
We're out of time.
Oh.
We are actually out of time. So I think I'm going to close it there. And I want to say thanks a lot, Steve Fuller. I think this has been very stimulating. I think I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure a lot of people have as well. So thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
And remember, those of you who want to come to the kind of book discussion at 3 o'clock, you're most welcome. Let's get a quick lunch first, though. Okay, thanks for coming.